Pero Peter Friedmann, el invitado ahora, y la idea es siempre en las juntas tener algo, ese tipo de invitados. Peter Friedmann, ahí está, mira, Peter Friedmann es lo que se le llama un Washington, D.C. insider. Él, por su conocimiento, todo lo que es comercio, transportación y poder político en el Capitolio. Como abogado en el Senado en su tiempo en Estados Unidos, él generó varias leyes de alto impacto en áreas de transporte, aduanas y recaudación. Hoy representa en Washington, D.C. a varias empresas de marcas conocidas a nivel mundial con operaciones de manufactura en todo el mundo, incluyendo México. También representa organismos como los agentes americanos, Retail Association of the United States y varios. Entonces, aquí para presentar, aquí está su semblanza en inglés, pero me da mucho gusto. Peter, welcome to Index Board Meeting in Monterrey, Mexico. The floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lalo. And it would be a pleasure to join you and to be speaking in Spanish to you. But unfortunately, neither are possible right now. But thank you very much, Lalo. And you introduced me as a Washington, D.C. insider. Sometimes I am inside the Capitol, but I was not inside the Capitol in January. So I'm here to speak with you today. Listen, everyone here, you may be considering what is the United States view and the Washington, D.C. view and the president's view of our relationship with Mexico generally, but more specifically with trade and business? And will it continue as it is? Will it increase or maybe be restricted? So that's what I would like to talk to you about today, because it's a very positive and I believe very optimistic view of what's coming. And I have some very specific reasons for believing that and specific reasons that you should believe it too. First of all, there is an association that represents all the customs brokers and freight forwarders, the people who handle all the international trade, import and export across the United States' largest trade gateway, that is the United States Pacific coast, from the Mexico border to the Canadian border. All the cargo that comes in, Los Angeles, Long Beach, Oakland, Seattle, Tacoma, all of that going all the way around the country, all of that is handled by customs brokers and freight forwarders that are members of this association. To give you an indication of how important these customs brokers and freight forwarders on behalf of the importers and exporters of the United States believe that trade with Mexico is, they have elected this last year, for the first time, the president of the association, someone who is a Mexico-U.S. border broker, somebody who specializes in handling maquiladora and other products moving across the border. Previously, the presidents all were focused on Los Angeles, Long Beach, ocean shipping, China. But this year, our president of this organization is from San Diego. And I believe he's going to be elected again because the trade with Mexico now is so important, equally important, in some cases more important than the trade from China and Vietnam and Korea. And so that president is your own Lalo Acosta, Eduardo Acosta, R.L. Jones. And it's a pleasure to be here with you because we know, not me speaking, not Lalo speaking, but the customs brokers and freight forwarders of the United States speaking, that our emphasis and focus is now on the U.S.-Mexico trade across the border. So that's why Lalo was elected, I believe, and will remain the president. So with that, let me talk a little bit about several things. One is President Biden and the Biden administration. What are their priorities? What are they going to be? And how is that going to impact all of you? Two, a little bit of our trade relations with China and how that's going to impact you, a little bit about our labor unions, the AFL-CIO, and their role with this administration and how that's going to impact you. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the global transportation crisis, which again is impacting everybody in manufacturing everywhere in the world, but certainly in the United States and Mexico. And then something that people have not focused on, but should, and that is the effort of the Canadian railroads to purchase the Kansas City Southern, which is the only north-south railroad in the United States, which connects very well to the Mexico rail system. If this merger goes through, it will create the first North American unified railroad company, Mexico, United States, Canada. And I think people are talking about all sorts of aspects of this, but I think the one that everybody listening in today should focus on is how this is going to accelerate the trade between the United States and Mexico, and how it's going to accelerate the shift of production for the U.S. consumer, for the U.S. manufacturers. Production of parts from China will shift faster than ever before to Mexico. That production is going to shift to Mexico because we're going to have this unified rail system. And I think that's very important to watch, and most commentators are not doing so yet. So that's why you came to this conference, to learn something new, right? We'll see if the merger goes forward, but watch that closely. So let's go back to the Biden administration and this Congress. Immigration across the southern border was one of the main issues of the presidential campaign this last year. For both President Trump and both candidate at the time, Biden, both were campaigning on the issue of cross-border immigration on the southern border. Now, what's happened? We have a new president, but not a new issue. Immigration on the southern border remains front and center in the minds of those in the Oval Office in the White House. It remains a major issue for Congress, and it will increase in terms of the visibility in the press here. The visibility in the press here, it has not been as great as maybe it is elsewhere, but it is growing. So the pressure is on President Biden to address a situation he was not expecting to have to address, the huge numbers of people coming across the border. And one of the ways he's going to address it, I believe, is to maximize, improve the trade relations that we have with Mexico. He may be forced, and he already is, to close the border to immigration, which he campaigned against. But he will want to open the border to more trade and commerce and transportation across the border. So I think if you're producing product in Mexico coming to the U.S. or importing product from the U.S. to Mexico, I think you're going to find a very supportive U.S. Department of Transportation, U.S. Department of State, and U.S. Treasury Department, and Customs and Border Protection as well. Now, question is, what will Customs and Border Protection focus upon? Well, they have a lot of issues to deal with. The imports of products from China, dealing with human rights standards in the countries where we import product from, the cotton and so forth. They're going to be focusing on that. But frankly, Customs and Border Protection, for better or worse in the United States, is focusing on the southern border. And I believe that their focus is going to be at first dealing with the immigration, but now shifting to the trade facilitation. Because I think more than anything, President Biden wants to have a good relationship with Mexico. And so the immigration challenges that because the steps that he will have to take and is taking challenge that relationship with Mexico. So he wants to assure that every place that he can control the relationship, it's a positive one, and that's in trade. And so there's a new Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. He will, I believe, spend a lot of time on the border issues and spend a lot of time there working on facilitating trade. That's a good thing. The other element that I want to talk about is China. China remains such a massive input source for U.S. manufacturing, for Mexico manufacturing, for the maquiladoras, et cetera. But one thing that COVID has shown us in the United States is we are too dependent on China. We are too dependent on China for pharmaceuticals, for the semiconductors, for the components that go into automobiles. So whether it's an automobile being assembled in Mexico or in Tennessee or Kentucky or Alabama, Mississippi or Detroit, all those production lines are being challenged now by a lack of semiconductors, a lack of components, of other components, engine components and so forth, that are delayed due to the transportation, collapse of transportation fluidity from Asia to the United States. So this is going to impact the desire of this administration to continue to move production sourcing from Asia Pacific, China, Korea, Vietnam, Japan, to our hemisphere, and that will primarily be to Mexico. We are probably going to continue the tariffs that President Trump imposed on imports from China. And while during the campaign there was criticism of those, President Biden will retain those tariffs on imports from China. In fact, those tariffs are extremely popular here in the United States and Washington, D.C. For the 3 years that President Trump had those major tariffs on imports from China, trying to create a barrier, in those 3 years, not one Republican and not one Democratic congressman, congresswoman, senator ever proposed one legislation, one amendment to either revoke or rescind or even modify those tariffs. Every member of Congress, 535 members of Congress, supported those tariffs then, and they support those tariffs today. They may be critical of Trump or Biden, but they are not critical of those tariffs that are designed to limit the imports of products from China. And those will therefore continue. Forget what the media says. Just count the votes. 535 members of Congress, all of them support the tariffs. Under a Republican president or a Democratic president, makes no difference. So those will remain in place. Further, one change now is that the AFL-CIO, which is our labor union umbrella organization, sent a letter early on to President Biden. First of all, they were delighted. President Biden is much closer to organized labor than President Trump was. The Democratic Congress in the House and in the Senate are much closer to organized labor, the labor unions, than the Republican members of Congress. So we expect that the labor unions will have much more influence with Congress and the White House for the next 4 years than they did for the last 4 years. So they sent a letter early on outlining their priorities from the president of the AFL-CIO to President Biden. And he said, let's maintain the tariffs on China. Let's add new tariffs like that on imports from Vietnam. And let's enforce some of the labor standards and wage standards in the USMCA. on Mexico. The labor unions here have never been in love with the NAFTA and now USMCA. But nonetheless, we've had NAFTA for many years, and it was not revoked. It was only expanded with the USMCA. There are provisions in there that would allow our labor unions or other labor unions in Mexico to bring some lawsuits regarding the labor. But we can take some comfort in that President Biden will only go so far with the labor unions here. He is going to keep the tariffs on the imports from China, but he has decided he is not going to impose restrictions on the imports from Vietnam. And you know that so much production in China, some came to Mexico, but so much of that production in China moved down to Vietnam and is coming into the United States from Vietnam now. So we were watching carefully. What is President Biden going to do? He decided not to declare Vietnam a currency manipulator, which would be the first step to imposing tariffs on imports from Vietnam. So we believe he's not going to impose those tariffs on products from Vietnam. What we can take from that is he's not going to do everything that the U.S. organized labor, the labor unions, would like him to do. So we believe that he is also not going to be enthusiastic about strict enforcement of some of the labor standards that are in the USMCA. For that reason, one, because he wants to keep trade going. Two, he can be somewhat independent of the labor unions. And three, back to the immigration issue. The immigration issue is going to cause him to be tougher on Mexico than he wanted to be, so he's going to have to be very favorable to Mexico in other areas where he can, and that would be in the USMCA, to assure that we can maximize the trade that's allowed under USMCA, not restrict it. So that's one element. We have another area.
Inge, ¿me escuchas?
I can hear you. We have another area that I think everybody needs to focus on. That's the global transportation crisis. Anybody who is importing product at all from Asia, and I think many of you are with maquiladoras and so forth, anybody in the United States as well, is knowing that the congestion, the delays, the transportation is in true crisis. Off of Los Angeles and Long Beach, we may have 35 ships sitting there waiting to come in to offload. This situation is not going to change. The delays in the transport, which are impacting on both sides of the border, manufacturing in the United States and in Mexico, are going to continue. How long will they continue? They will continue as long as we love to order by e-commerce and have everything delivered by Amazon or whoever tomorrow. As long as we stay in our homes and are ordering everything to be delivered overnight, and that's becoming our national pastime, the volume of imports into the United States, Canada, Mexico, the Western Hemisphere, into Europe, the imports of consumer goods and manufacturing components is going to continue. As long as that continues, we are going to have this transportation crisis. As long as that volume of imports continues, we are going to be delaying assembly lines. We are going to be shutting down production for a while we can wait to build inventories everywhere in the world, but nowhere more than in United States, Canada, and Mexico, where the congestion and the crisis is greatest. So what does that tell us? It tells us that we're going to be in this situation for a while, when the best information to obtain in order to predict how long this crisis continues is probably talking to a major importer. Talk to Amazon. Talk to Walmart. How long are they going to be importing these volumes? And they tell us, they tell me, that they have orders that are still out all the way into January 2022. As long as those orders keep piling in above the capacity of the ocean carriers to carry them, there are not enough ships, there are not enough containers, and above the capacity of the ports, port authorities to handle them in LA and Long Beach, in Oakland on the West Coast, but many of you get your imports through LA and Long Beach. Those delays will continue. Those ports and the marine terminals are not big enough to handle those massive ships. Many of us have high hopes that the Mexico ports on the west side of Mexico, Pacific Ocean side of Mexico, can be built, can grow, can have the capacity to handle some of that cargo, a lot of that cargo that is now going to LA, Los Angeles, and Long Beach, and then has to go across the border down to where you are. Wouldn't it be more efficient if that cargo could come directly to a Mexico port? And there are a couple ports, you know them well, on the Pacific Ocean side. And that puts us right back to the railroads, because that railroad link I was discussing does connect from the Canadian Pacific coast through the heartland of Canada, through the heartland of the United States, where all the manufacturing goes on, from Chicago and Memphis and Detroit and so forth, all the way down through Texas, all the way into Mexico, and all the way to the Mexico Pacific coast, where that cargo could come in. So you would have a fluid area. That is something that creates some optimism in the eyes of some of us who are very much engaged with the international logistics. If you're involved in international logistics, you know we need more capacity, and I think Mexico has the possibility of contributing greatly to some of the solutions. Meanwhile, the message to Congress here and to the White House here is we are too dependent on China for our imports, for pharmaceuticals, for engine components, and so forth. And those productions have moved out of China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, India. But the ocean transportation challenges face those sources as well. You can source from India or Philippines or Malaysia instead of China, and Vietnam instead of China, but you will still face the same ocean transportation delays and challenges. So that tells us, it tells the policymakers here in Washington, we need to move that production closer home into the United States or near the United States. And I think anytime a member of Congress or a president says, oh, we ought to make it here, they may be thinking here is in the United States of America, but you know, and I know, any of us in logistics know, here really means Canada, United States, and Mexico, and not just for politics. But look at, when you talk about Detroit as a place where we manufacture cars, do you know almost every one of those cars goes to Canada before it's completed? And virtually every one of those cars has components from all over the world, but very high percentage from Mexico. And you know, Mexico production also goes to the manufacturing of the cars under the Japanese labels, Nissan and Toyota and Honda and so forth, in the United States Southeast. So when people talk about we got to manufacture more here, it will redound to the benefit of production in Mexico. And then some of those components or the whole product will come into the United States. So that's definitely in the works. Members of Congress are committed to that. President Biden has introduced proposals as part of his infrastructure package to facilitate more, not only transportation domestically, but more production in the United States. He was very critical of the tariffs we imposed on China, but he's still going to keep them on China. But he doesn't want to get into trade wars with different countries like President Trump was willing to do. Although President Biden continues to maintain the tariffs, he prefers another approach. And this approach is going to benefit anybody producing manufacturing in Mexico for the US market. His approach is that we create incentives to manufacture products here. Again, politicians may think here being the United States, but under USMCA, here means United States, Canada, and Mexico. That members of Congress may not even understand that, but the fact is the production will go to those three countries. So he is proposing massive new programs to propose manufacturing here in the United States. For example, in his green climate control, climate change, which is environmental, which is a huge, huge issue, I think for him, but even more so for the Democratic Party in Congress, very high priority issue. A very key component is manufacturing solar, wind, geothermal, the green energy here, again, in the United States, which means in Mexico and in Canada. He does not like that we import all these windmills, the electricity generators, those massive windmills. He doesn't like them all coming in from overseas. And the AFL-CIO, the labor union, doesn't like it either. They want to build them here. And so I think we're going to see more of that manufacturing for the green energy agenda of the president and of the Democrats in the House and Senate to mean more production manufacturing here, United States and Mexico. With the components coming in, I could well see Maquiladora start building the generators, the big veins may be built in the United States. They come together, creating jobs on both sides. So whether it is President Biden's green climate change or green energy agenda, or whether it is his agenda of having a better, smoother, softer relationship with our neighbor to the south, to Mexico, whether it is the challenge of China, and this will be the final thing I want to talk about. The challenge with China for the United States is not just economic. It's not just manufacturing. It's not the fact that we're dependent on China for everything, everything we wear, our clothing, everything. The reason that we're really concerned is global status, military status. China has invaded and taken over the South China Sea. If there's going to be a next world war, it's going to be between the United States and China on who controls the South China Sea, which China has just taken over. Scares Japan, scares Korea, scares Philippines, scares the world, but they are relentless in China in expanding their power, their geography in Africa and Asia and in South America. That's a concern. How are we going to deal with it? Another concern, major, of the White House is the human rights. How are they treating the people who live in the eastern region of China, where most of the cotton in China comes from, and a huge percentage of the cotton produced in the world, and thus the cotton that's in the textiles? We have very strict Customs and Border Protection enforcement now, trying to find any product coming into the United States, either through the ocean gateways, through the land borders from Mexico or from Canada or anywhere else, or air, against any garment, any footwear, any product that has that cotton that originally came from that eastern portion of China. So we have our challenges with China. Our agenda is economic, our agenda is military, our agenda is human rights, our agenda is environmental. And that's the last thing we'll talk about, the environmental. We first got back into the Paris Climate Accord, which President Trump removed the United States from. It doesn't have very many very specific requirements, but it was more of a statement that we're concerned about climate change, global warming. We're now back into it. This president wants to be very active. One way to be active is to reduce the global footprint of carbon emissions, of the ships coming across the oceans, bringing our cargo, as opposed to trains bringing cargo back and forth between the United States and Mexico. So we have those priorities that are not necessarily trade priorities, but each of them has an impact on our trade relationships and for production and sourcing and employment in Mexico for the US market. And I think people who focus too much on the president's climate change initiatives or strategic initiatives or human rights initiatives miss the real impact on manufacturing, on sourcing, on logistics, and all those answers go to the benefit of nearshoring, of producing closer to home, and closer to home under the USMCA umbrella. So that's my view of where things are going, and my suggestion that we don't look only at something that has a headline that says trade policy, but environmental policy, human rights policy, global strategic policy, all of those have a very direct impact on manufacturing and support increased manufacturing in Mexico coming to the United States and Canada as well. So that's my view, and we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for having me.
Peter, thank you very much. Appreciate that update. Always very energetic and always full of great information for a lot of us here. Thank you very much. Hope you have a nice day, and it goes well into our next segue. Pardon? Peter, you want to take a few questions? Hay preguntas? Peter, would you take a few questions?
Only if they're easy.
Pusieron en mute.
Only if they're easy questions. Yes, I will.
Okay. I promise if you answer one of these properly, we'll invite you to Guadalupe. I know how much you love it down there, so we will invite you there one of these days.
Okay. It's a deal. I love Valle de Guadalupe.
Una pregunta. Here we go.
Somebody has his hand up.
Yes, I think somebody is on Zoom. They want to, well, in the meantime, Peter, thank you for your presentation. A lot of insight in 30 minutes. Thanks a lot for the support that you're giving us. Thanks a lot for the support you're giving Lalo. Lalo is in charge of the binational committee, and part of his role with us in Index is just to open us the doors in the US and understand what's going on. And as you mentioned, it is not just trade policy with custom brokers. All these China, Vietnam, or the situation in the south of China, situation on the labor, with labor unions. I think this is moving forward very fast. And what we're seeing right now for ourselves is that we're so much engaged in what is happening in Mexico that we are not looking into what is happening or could happen in the US or Canada, okay? So having this binational committee, Lalo, will allow us to understand what is truly going on, sorry. And I would like, I don't know if Emilio, if you could just share some insights. You were part of this group as well. You can provide us with some input of what you see on the ally shoring and what we hear from this meeting, conference, sorry.
Yeah, hi, Peter. Great presentation, first of all. I do have one question, and then I'll jump into what Luis asked me. But the question, I would leave it there, is do you see the U.S. investing in resources at CBP at the border so we can divide the issues of immigration and trade? Because that has been a big problem for us. the Homeland Security taking out agents to put them to cover the immigration issue instead of the traditional border crossing they were doing. So that would be my question. If you wanna
Yep.
take, it's an easy one, so you can say no and that's it, and you get
Well,
wine.
what we want is easy. How we get it is always more difficult. But I would say this. This is a very big concern for all of us right now. And we've been working very hard on this. It is apparent that, first of all, for the last 4 years, and it may continue, CBP, Customs and Border Protection, which is a bureau within the Department of Homeland Security, has become less independent. The Customs and Border Protection used to be the Customs Service, and the Commissioner of Customs made the policies. But then, as we know, because we saw the Commissioner of Customs under President Trump was basically standing next to President Trump holding his bags while President Trump visited the border fence, barrier, wall. So that put him in a very uncomfortable but very new situation, because customs has always been about trade facilitation and maybe some enforcement, but certainly not about the level of enforcement, the immigration issues, and so on. So the decisions of policies of what CBP is going to do, where its resources are going to be deployed, are no longer being made at Customs and Border Protection. They haven't been for the last 3 years, and I don't think they will be for the next 3 years. Will they be made at the Department of Homeland Security? I don't think so. They weren't for 3 years. They won't for next. They are going to be made in the Oval Office of the White House, right behind me. They're going to be made right there by the President, by the Cabinet, by the Secretary of Commerce, by the Secretary of Defense, all those. Those are people making decisions, and decisions are going to be made at the highest levels in Congress as to what the positions should be, but on what CBP is going to do. And I can tell you, thus far, and for the foreseeable future, the focus, unfortunately, is exclusively on immigration, because that's when CNN and MSNBC and Fox News and everybody's covering. CNN doesn't go down there and cover when a truck smoothly gets through the border in Laredo or in Otay Mesa and everything is very efficient and the commerce moves. Does CNN cover that and put it on the news? No, they don't. What they want to see is lots of people homeless on one side of the border or another. That's what they like to show, and that's what the White House and the parties have to respond to. So I think for the foreseeable future, we are going to be stressed, all of us, all of you and me and all of us who are here to facilitate trade across the borders, we're going to be stressed. We have already begun, I've been working with Lalo on ways that we can maximize the priority of international trade within Customs and Border Protection with the new leadership of Customs and Border Protection. We have, once again, a policeman, an officer of the law, coming in as Commissioner of Customs. But just below, there are some deputy commissioners who can focus a little more on trade. We are working already, Lalo and the Pacific Coast Council and others, some of the importers and exporters, are working with people like Senator Wyden of Oregon, who is the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, or Congressman Richie Neal, who is the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. Those are the committees with jurisdiction over trade, over USMCA, over Customs and Border Protection. And we are working with them. I spoke with Richie Neal yesterday. What are we going to do to assure that CBP has the resources? And I've been clear with him and with Senator Wyden. It is up to them to convey to the White House that there's more to do on the Mexico-US border than just immigration. That trade has to be facilitated and the resources have to be provided. We are seeking an additional appropriation so that Customs will have the money for it. Now our task is to keep that money going to people who facilitate the trade, who do the trade clearances and so forth, and not let that money get diverted to people who are going to be doing very important work, but work that's related more to the immigration than it is to trade. It's a huge problem. It is the number one challenge, I believe, for the U.S. Trade community in our relations with Mexico, even more than the big issues. I think this is the biggest challenge we have, and we're going to work on it. Now, I'll just leave you with this. Here's something positive and very, very effective that everybody that's participating here today can do and work with us on it. You may recall a couple of years ago, President Trump, quite upset with Mexico over the immigration and so forth, announced that in 1 month, there will be a 5% import duty on anything coming into the United States from Mexico. Quite a shock, considering that under NAFTA, there hasn't been any import duties on the products coming in, and with such short notice. So what did we do? We did not stand up in front of CNN or Fox and say what a terrible policy and so forth. But we did write a letter to the Commissioner of Customs, and also some of us let it leak up above him to Department of Homeland Security, and even to the White House, it got to them, saying we're not taking any position on the policy. We're not saying it's good or bad. All we're telling you is that there's no mechanism in place now for exporters from Mexico to pay the 5%, for our importers here to pay the 5%. There's no mechanism for customs or any other U.S. agency to collect the 5% duties. It just can't work. Maybe in a couple of years you could develop a process, but it can't work, and it certainly can't work in a month. We said expressly, we're not commenting on whether it's a good policy or not. We're just telling you how it won't work. Like a mechanic. They don't care whether the engine's going fast or no, but it's got to tell you if the engine will start. We were telling them the engine won't start. It doesn't work. That letter somehow was leaked, and it got to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, the Financial Times, Le Monde of Paris, all over the world. It went all over the world that there was this new policy that won't work. And you know what happened? The president walked it back. He said, well, if that's the case, then I'm pulling it back. That's what some things that people on this call can do. You don't have to get involved in the big policy issues. You can just tell the people in government who may not really understand how trade works, the everyday processes, whether those processes can accommodate their policies or not. And I think that can be very effective. Lalo signed the letter that went to the Commissioner of Customs. And ever since then, any letter Lalo signs, people read carefully.
No, let's not say. Well, that was just lucky. I was the wrong place at the right time. That's what happened there. Una pregunta, there's one more question, Peter. Israel está en la línea. ¿Ya tiene la pregunta lista? One more question.
Yeah, Scott, he's muted.
Yeah. Hey, Peter, congratulations on your participation.
Thank you.
I cannot agree more with some of the points that you have mentioned. I do work with Caterpillar. That's the company that pays my check every month. I participate with Index since 15 years ago, I believe. I'm responsible for the Foreign Trade Committee at the national level. And I have been involved very deeply on the USMCA negotiation, as well as some of the recent policies that both President Trump and then now President Biden are trying to push the U.S. Couple of big, very, very specific questions. On the supply chain threats that President Biden is trying to look for, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals that you just mentioned, and how to bring or nearshore that, do you see, and I like your vision about us in the US includes Canada and Mexico, right? Do you see the US investing in Mexico in order to develop these supply chains that might threaten national security or public health in North America? Do you see the Biden administration and Congress in the United States willing to look at some options to invest in Mexico to get cost-effective materials in the region? Because that's a real challenge when you compete against Asia and China. Cost-effective materials, right?
Yeah.
In order to develop, for example, all the silica mines that we might have potential in Mexico for semiconductors that we don't have developed today. That would be the first question. And second question, you know that the United States got pulled from TPP.
Yeah.
But now we have CPTPP without the United States. Although, do you see the United States investors and manufacturers leveraging the position of Mexico and Canada on CPTPP, selling from those countries to the Asia bloc, that agreement?
That's an interesting question. One of the reasons I like participating in these types of conferences, because while I'm involved in this every day, it seems like every minute, and my wife says on the weekends too, but when I participate, once in a while you get a completely new thought, new approach that I hadn't thought of. I can understand where this is coming from or where it's going, but it's invigorating for me to have a new thought come in that's something completely new. So that's great, Israel. Let me think about that for a second. I think it's positive, but let me go back, and here's why it could be the answer to both of your questions. When you say, will the United States invest in sourcing and supply chain in Mexico to replace our dependency or reduce our dependency on Asia and so forth. The question is, who invests? Is it the government that is going to invest in infrastructure by selecting the projects, the locations of building, whether rail or roads, or I was going to also talk about rare earth minerals and how we're so dependent. It's crazy how we're dependent on our soon-to-be enemies on the minerals that we need to communicate with each other and to run our ships and our battleships and our rockets and ammunition. We have to go to China to ask them for permission to get their rare earth minerals that we need. So is the government going to do the mining? I think with this administration, this Congress, they're probably more inclined, certainly than Republicans are, to have the government actually do these things. But I even so believe that when I say that we're going to have this near-shoring of manufacturing and production for our market here being done here, that is going to be through incentives to the private sector. So it's going to be the private sector that will make those investments. Well, like Caterpillar. I mean, nobody built Caterpillar a plant in Kansas so that you're not doing anything in Mexico. But the trade relationship, the trade policy, the trade treaty, and our general tax policies and so forth make it possible and facilitate a private company, Caterpillar, from making that investment in the place that is most efficient. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing. I don't know that they will sell it. Look at President Trump and President Biden are not that different in many ways. Forget the media. They like to say how they're so different. Look at what they're doing. Look at what's happening on the border now with immigration, problem for both. And look what they're doing on trade with China and the tariffs. They're doing the same thing. Both of them will want to be able to cut a ribbon at a new manufacturing plant in Nebraska or Michigan. But in fact, many of their policies will result in new manufacturing plants in Mexico or Canada. But they're not going to go to Mexico to cut the ribbon. But nonetheless, their policies lead to that. And I think we're going to see more of that. So the investment in supply chain infrastructure is going to be done by the private sector. And that's the reality. Now, when it gets to whether, we probably all agree, everybody here, that one of the worst decisions made was to get out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That would have been brilliant. Strategically, it was everybody in the Pacific Rim except for China. What a great way to isolate China if that's what people want to do. Brilliant. But to give you the idea of the politics, by the time the presidential debates came, President Trump and Hillary Clinton both competed with each other to express their disdain, their opposition for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Never mind that as Secretary of State, she had advocated it, but they want to get elected. And that's what these politicians have in common here and in Mexico, right? They want to get elected. So to get elected, in the Democratic side, they have to play to the labor unions. The labor unions are absolutely opposed to Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so Hillary Clinton and even Barack Obama before that were talking about how NAFTA was a horrible thing. And then afterwards, Hillary Clinton and President Trump, or Donald Trump at the time candidate, were competing with each other about how terrible TPP was because they want to get elected. Those politics remain the same here. Members of Congress are still going to be influenced, as I mentioned at the outset, by the labor unions. And so will President Biden. So we can't get back in because labor unions oppose it with the majority party that's here in Washington, D.C. right now. So that's not going to happen. Can we go sort of backdoor? That's a decision that's going to be made not by our government. It's going to be made by companies such as yours who decide we're going to locate a production facility in a country which could benefit from this agreement. And you're not going to advertise it. You're not going to tell the president, hey, you're not going to tell the labor unions, but that's going to be part of your decision as to why Caterpillar is in Mexico. It's for various reasons. Could be labor, tax, environmental, whatever, but trade could be one. But those are decisions that you're going to keep to yourselves, but you're going to be making the decisions, not just you, every company.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Really appreciate. Thank you. We'll wrap this up. Peter, have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you very much. And if any questions come up, I'll send them to you. Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
that.
Thank you for your leadership, Lalo.